Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for staying or arriving today for this special presentation. We are very, very blessed that someone who walked into the doors of this church a year or so ago brings with her such an amazing story. Eve is about to publish a book about her life. And it's called something like Transgender at 7, Out at 84. And so she has an incredible story that's a cross-cultural story. It's a historical, amazing story of how much life and things have changed in 84 years, 85 years. And I'm so grateful for her generosity in taking the time and having the courage to tell this amazing story. And you won't hear a more amazing story anywhere in MCC, a story that will really touch your hearts and bring a sense of amazement at the way in which God brings us through and to community. So will you welcome our sister Eve?
Buenos días. Yo soy Eve y tengo el placer de hablarles la historia de mi vida. Guten Morgen, schönen guten Tag. Ich bin sehr dankbar, dass ich euch heute etwas über mein Leben erzählen darf. Well, after all, I read from the Acts. They spoke in various languages, and I thought you would all understand. I was prepared to spend a couple hours here, but I'm told that that would be too selfish. And so I have to cut out some of it. I'm leaning a lot on the manuscript of my book, which will be out in about a month. It's fully ready now, except for the print. In about a week, Amazon is going to get early sales orders, and so it's coming. But before I begin, now that it's been abbreviated and Joe warned me that I should be brief, I should thank someone who was so instrumental in introducing me to this wonderful, wonderful church. And that was Siri of my cell phone. I moved here after my wife died of cancer at the age of 82. I moved here from Vancouver to be closer to my daughter who lives on the island and has a boutique here. And she was aware of my transgender status, but not to the extent it is today. And we both consulted. I wanted some involvement in the community or some understanding audience for my cross-dressing, if you will. And so we consulted Siri on my cell phone. Would she send me to people that are loving, honest, God-fearing, and there was only one church she could recommend, and that's this church. You know, I can't wait till Sunday comes around to get my battery recharged and get all the hugs and kisses, and I'm just overwhelmed. And I'm so grateful to you for even being here and listening to me, because I'm 85 years old, and I was prepared to talk about 85 years of life, but now I have to cut it down. So. I would like to, there's a question and answer period, but if in the meantime, this book here is a beautiful book. It's all pictures of East Prussia. I'll now introduce everybody here. And on page 638 are pictures of the city of Marienburg. That's the castle where I shook Hitler's hand on April 20, 1943. And if anyone wants to use it while we're talking, please come and get it and make use of it. Page 160 shows the pictures of the city in which I was born, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let me introduce my cast here. To the far left here is my beautiful wife of 36 years, Carol. We met at a charm school for transgender people at the Oregon coast. She was a professional model and also taught modeling at a modeling school. And the owner of that school, who had engaged 80 people to learn how to walk like a woman, sit like a woman, act like a woman, make up like a woman, had asked their staff of some 16 women to come and teach us. Now, of course, 1 week of teaching women's mannerism is a joke, because you women do so much better all your life. But we tried, and Carol was there as an instructor. We met the first day after I had just been told that my first marriage of 25 years was down the drain, and when I would come back, I would find my stuff out the window and on the lawn. So I entered this charm school with a new adventure spirit. And I'll get into that a little later. But first, let's begin at the beginning. I was born February 19, 1933 in Königsberg. This map, dating back to 1938, shows on the right-hand top corner, that's the state of East Prussia, which at the end of World War II was given as retribution. The part north of that line to Russia, and the bottom part to Poland. And 14 million people were kicked out, sent back to Western Germany, leaving everything. This is Königsberg. It's now called Kaliningrad. It's a Russian seaport today. I met Hitler here in Marienburg, where we lived, and from where we began our refuge from the Russians. This picture is Caitlin Jenner, my daughter Maureen, and me at a recent visit. She and I are collaborating on trying to prevent suicides of especially young people. We have a mission going, and that's our purpose. I'm getting into the medical aspects of transgenderism for time's sake. I think it's more interesting to you at this point to listen a little bit about what happened to us. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and I, in my patriotic spirit, signed up to the Hitler Youth to render some assistance. I was issued a bicycle, and I was a bicycle messenger, bringing messages from headquarters to the front lines, where they were digging tank traps, as though that would have stopped the Russians. And also joined the Hitler Youth, which was mandatory at the age of 10. I was in a drum and bugle corps, issued a big drum, and the purpose of that was to alert people of air raids and the like, or find splinters after bombing raids, which were turned in to make more weaponry. My birthplace, as I mentioned, is no longer German. It's Kaliningrad, and Marlburg is the city of Marienburg, which was a beautiful castle. Now, a major event happened at Marienburg at the age of 10. It was my inauguration into the 10-year-olds into the Hitler Youth, which was mandatory. Not to say that I wasn't envious of the Hitler Youth girls, but a girl by the name of Helga and I were selected to present Hitler with flowers when he was taking the reviewing stand with thousands and thousands of Hitler Youth and SS people, torch lights and so on assembled. He chose Marienburg for its Germanic and symbolic stature. It was a beautiful castle with moats and drawbridges, and he came with his Mercedes into the inner courtyard, cobblestone courtyard, and greeted us in the reviewing stand, clapped us on the shoulder after we did our Hitler salute, and said, "You are our future." You know, those were his words. It was a very momentous occasion, you know, because Germany was still doing well in 1943, some progress in the war, which later, of course, went all to hell. And so it was a big moment. In summer of every year, my parents were both from big farms in East Prussia. My father was one of 14, and he enlisted in 1929 when Germany was granted an army after the Versailles Treaty, World War I. And he worked his way up the ranks. To the end, he was a major, wounded 13 times during World War II. My mother was one of 7, and when she was 18, her rich farm family sent her to France to gain manners and lycée, you know, as it's customary in those days. And we, in turn, worked on the mother farm my uncle operated. And at the age of 8, 9, I was riding a 2-horse team of manure and bringing the rye and the wheat in from the fields, and really did a full man's job. I'm cutting short some of the finer detail of that because it's not that meaningful. Let's see. The important part was that prior to our refuge, the Russians had a reputation of utter brutality as they invaded East Prussia, and yet the Gauleiter of East Prussia, Koch, forbade anyone from doing early preparations for fleeing the Russians. It was under the threat of persecution. And so, as a result, thousands of people died because the state of East Prussia was totally unprepared. As the Russians came in, streets were packed with trucks and horse-drawn wagons and so on, and they were not out to explore, but to flee the Russians. On January 23rd, the building, we lived in an apartment building in Marienburg, was being hit by Russian grenade fire. The day before, I should mention, my grandma, 80 years, had joined us from Mehlsack. Literally translated, Mehlsack means flour sack. It's a small city northeast of where we lived. And our building was being demolished at the gable side. And Mother said, "Okay, kids, quickly pack a knapsack. We got to run for our lives." It was 20 below 0 Celsius, which was about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. We all packed a knapsack, and I secretly packed my closest possessions at the time, a blouse and a skirt, which I had stolen from my mother at age 7. She had no knowledge of it. The other things were underwear, socks, handkerchiefs, and the like. We set out at 2 o'clock after having a bite to eat, 2 a.m., we had a bite to eat. We left everything at the table and set out in the snow, big snowstorm, and as I said, it's a very cold temperature. We walked about 6 kilometers or 7 kilometers until we came upon a barn where we found refuge and could sleep the night on the hay there. The following morning brought a couple surprising discoveries to my mother especially, and to all of us. In the morning, I tried to wake Grandma to get going. She got up, took some stumbling steps, fell over and said, "That is the end." And she died. She froze to death. She had frozen to death during the night. And people tried to help and load her on the horse-drawn wagon, but it was too late. She was dead, and who wanted to carry a dead woman around? We left her where she lay and set out. An experience which to this day has affected me very much. After being on the road for a while, we came across a woman sitting in the snow, leaning against a tree with a dead baby in her arms. My mother tried desperately to persuade her to come with us, but she would not budge. She said she is going to stay there and die with her baby. And that was typical. The highways and the side of the roads were filled or covered with a lot of people that had died, and no one bothered to bury them. There was no time for it. Highways were clogged with horse-drawn wagons, not unlike the wagon train in America with tarps and so on. People had prepared for this, but terribly clogged highways. That came to our advantage as a German convoy of military trucks was stuck on the road, and my mother was able to persuade the two German soldiers to give us a ride. So we hopped on the back of the truck, and lo and behold, it was filled with 100-pound sacks of coffee beans. Now, if you imagine in this time of disaster and war, coffee beans was the one thing that these soldiers were trying to save. After about 40 kilometers, they decided to go northbound towards Danzig, and we wanted to go towards Berlin, so we got off the truck and thanked them and made our way to the nearest railroad station in Preußisch Stargard, which was crowded with thousands of people trying to flee. Just then, a steam engine with about 15 cattle cars and flatbeds slowly came into the station. Some soldiers opened the doors of the cattle cars and unloaded many, many dead soldiers, frozen soldiers, piled them up against the side of the train station. In the meantime, there was an air raid alert. Some Russian fighter planes were flying over and firing machine guns at those assembled at the train station. So everybody ran back to the terminal, except about 50 of us. We crouched by the side of the platform, and that saved our life, because the space that had just been vacated by those who had died, we took up. We found a corner in a cattle car with about 100 other people and about 16 soldiers that were severely wounded. There was a terrible stench in the car. And this car became our home for the next 11 days. It left and it stopped, and it left and it stopped. You never knew how long. And after 3 days of this, we hadn't eaten at all. And we came to the city of Schneidemühl, which was just about here. And Mother said, I have to see what I can do to get some food for you kids. An older brother and a younger sister. She left the train in a station and went into town. Discovered a bakery that had just baked some fresh bread, and fought physically for a couple loaves of breads, only to come running back to the station to try to be with us, except the train was starting to pull out. It was gaining speed. And with all her might, she ran after the last car, screaming. And someone pulled her into the last car to save her and reunite her with us later on. In my opinion, it was always God's hands that provided this rescue. The train ride was, to say the least, very experimental. You never knew how long it would run or how long it would stay. Oftentimes, Russian fighter planes were shooting at it. At one point, the engine in a couple of cars were unhooked, and the engine took off without the rest of us because he was running low in water, and we didn't realize that. And so we could hear the fighting coming closer, the shooting, and then just in time, he came back and coupled up the rest of the train to progress. After another 5 or 6 days of this, we knew from experience by now that the stop was just too long. We had been sitting there for several hours, and so some of the soldiers in our cattle car opened the door carefully to look out and discovered that the engine and the first 2 cars had been uncoupled and taken off. It contained some military people, and I guess they wanted to lessen the load and took off without us. And we could hear the fighting getting closer from the nearby forest, and eventually the doors were ripped open by gray-clad Mongolian Russians shooting their submachine guns into the ceiling. All military people were evacuated first, then we all had to leave the car. And before us, they executed all military people in a ditch along a cemetery wall. Then my mother was torn away from us by Russians. She tried to fight them, but with a machine gun pointed at her heart or a knife, there was just no saving her. She and many other women, including pregnant women and very young women, were taken into the house and raped many times. She was gang raped by 5 Mongolian Russians. And even later in life, when she would wake up from a sleep, she would cry because this memory of the rape that she couldn't defend. History has determined that approximately 2 million German women were raped by Russians at the end of World War II. 2 million. My mother was later reunited with us. We were taken to a Russian prison camp where we were issued shovels and picks and wheelbarrows, and we had to fill potholes from grenades in the highways. And then my mother came, and one night, as it was getting darker at about 5 p.m., we hid in a culvert under the highway. And as everybody was driven back to camp, we stayed there until it was dark, and we had escaped from the camp. We hid during the day. We hid in the forests, and at night we would try to progress towards the border with German troops. And lo and behold, after about 7 days of this, we suddenly found ourselves in German territory, where the Red Cross put us up in a air raid shelter during a raid at Berlin, and then in Potsdam, which is about 30 miles west of Berlin, in an apartment that had been vacated by a Nazi who had fled to the west. We tried to maintain with food. As an example, we heard about some barges on fire in the half of the river, the canal between Potsdam and Berlin, and that the barges contained some food. So Mother took my brother and me to the barge, left us down on a rope into the hold of the smoldering barge to try to shovel some rice out of it, which would have lasted us a long time, only to suddenly be strafed by Russian fighter planes. As Mother heard them coming, she hid behind a pylon on deck, and we crouched against the side of the ship as bullets hit the side of the ship. And then we shoveled a bucket of rice, and Mother pulled us up, and that was it. That was typical. I also had found in Park Sanssouci, which was the park of Frederick the Great in Potsdam, a beautiful park where we lived, a baker's bike. A baker's bike is a three-wheel bike with a box in the back, and in the old days, bakers would deliver their bread and rolls in that bike to people. Except it had no tires. It had rims, but no tires. But that didn't disturb anyone from making it the local kid transportation system that we handled. We also found some field telephones and installed them from our friends to other friends, only to have neighbors come begging my mother, please have the kids get rid of the phones. The Russians see that, they think it's spies. Well, I'm shortchanging a lot of the story here, but eventually the fighting reached Potsdam. Oh, first of all, important event. On April 14, 1945, my mother's birthday, the Allies decided that Potsdam hadn't had a real bombing attack, and 500 Lancaster bombers came and bombed Potsdam. You could see it coming at night. The targets were Christmas trees that set up the targets for the coming bombers. We all progressed to the air raid shelter in our apartment building, which was a long room, not unlike this room. There were 68 actual tenants that found refuge. All of a sudden, a big explosion and terrible noise and cement falling off the walls and collapsing on us. A big bomb had hit the building and collapsed it entirely. And of the 68 people, 34 on the far end of the building were dead. 2 days later, they dug us out through the air vents after they had first removed the mortar off us, But then the Red Cross put us up in another apartment building, and life continued. Now that the Russians had taken control of most of the eastern part of Germany and most of Berlin, except for the American sector, and the American army, the American government was controlling Western Germany. My father was trying to reach us in Potsdam. He had known from one postcard that he had received at the front lines that we were in Potsdam. But I have omitted to tell you how he got freed. He was fighting in a kettle. I'm so sorry, Doug. It's not even there. This lake here is called Frischer Hafen. It's 80 miles long and about 4 miles wide. My father's position was he was encapsulated in a pocket here at the northeastern side of the lake by the Russians, and the only rescue he could find would be to get to the peninsula of Frischer. That's that tongue that is closest to the Baltic Sea. So he commanded his unit to swim through the 4-mile wide lake with ice in it. He clung to a barn door, made it to the island, where on May 3rd, he was wounded for the 13th time in trying to show another officer into position. He was hit by shrapnel. Well, the only out would have been with some minesweepers, some very small boats that were left, but only reserved for wounded soldiers. So the fact that he was wounded and carried onto one of these minesweepers saved his life again. He sailed the Baltic Sea and was taken POW by the British of Denmark when the war was over. The war in Germany ended on May the 8th. 1945. He had himself released to a relative in Western Germany, and in trying to find us or get to us in Potsdam, which was in the Russian control, he saw an ad where truck drivers were required to bring a convoy of trucks to Berlin to serve for the logistics of the American sector of Berlin. He signed up as a truck driver, drove the truck with 80 other trucks to Berlin, where they were interned in a school building, awaiting their transport back to West Germany. In those days, there was a curfew between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., and he was not allowed to leave. No, he was only 30 miles away from where we were. So he tried to find any opportunity to get in touch with us. Well, God's guidance of a man helped us out. This passerby, who felt pity with my dad, agreed to present a note to us that read as follows. I'm missing a lot of pages already. Well, it said, in so many words, it said, "I'm in Berlin, being held by Americans. Please come immediately," and gave us the address of this particular school where they were being kept. I had stolen a bike of a Russian who had stolen it of a German and had rehabbed it. It was just an ordinary men's bike. So at the age of 12, I put my mother on the front of the bike, on the arm, and I drove her 30 miles on the Autobahn to Berlin, where we were reunited with my dad. And he had gotten permission from the American lieutenant in charge that we could come back on the trucks to Western Germany. So I drove my mother back to Potsdam, the 30 miles. In the meantime, it was harder to do because I developed dysentery. Now, every ditch was mine. And we got back to Potsdam, quickly loaded what few possessions we had onto a bike trailer, and I have forgotten to mention that my brother had run away from home. He was 2 years older than I was. He was 14. He had gone back to East Prussia one day without telling us. We found his books in this kayak we have found. In fact, the kayak is a story that I also omitted talking about. It was a beautiful mahogany kayak, and there's a beautiful lake between Berlin and Potsdam called Wannsee. And my brother and I would paddle on Wannsee, as boys will do. Occasionally bumped into something only to determine it was another dead person that had been left from the bombs. I never finished, oh yeah, I did finish the story about the bombing. And so I loaded my sister onto the bike trailer, hooked it to the bike, she in her cardboard box, my mother on the front of the bike, and I drove her back to Potsdam the next day, to Berlin. In the meantime, this lieutenant had changed his mind, and he said no civilians on the trucks, taking these guys back to West Germany. Well, during the night, my dad and some of his buddies were not to be deterred. They put our bikes and trailers onto the truck that was going to take them back on the side benches. And they hid us under some tarps on one of the trucks. And early in the morning at 7, they took off for the West German part, drove about 200 kilometers, got off for food and came back on, whispered, "This is our last stop." And suddenly, the tarp was lifted by a black GI. Someone had squealed, and we had to disembark. My dad went on, he had to go on with our luggage. And mother, sister, and I were standing in no man's land, about 200 kilometers, that's about 150 miles or so, from the border. And in those days, it was already Cold War, and the Russians would kill anyone trying to cross the border. We made 4 unsuccessful attempts each time we were caught by Russian patrols once we reached the border. One time we were hidden in some rye stacks while a guide was making the rounds to collect his bounty. All of a sudden, Russian patrol with their dogs and lights, and we were taken back to a camp. That happened 4 times. 5th time, we were lying in a potato field in the dark, trying to, about 1,000 meters from the border, when in the dark of the night we could see the shadow of 3 German former soldiers quickly come walking towards the border. We tagged after them, and even though they begged us to get lost, because their kids would make noise and so on, we didn't. We found ourselves going through a swamp, through a creek bed where my mother lost one of her shoes. And then all of a sudden they said we're across. We went up a hill, some barbed wire, and then we were across. We made our way to the little village in West Germany, Niedershausen, where my dad had been assigned a small room, the size of a small bedroom, where we were reunited about a week or 2 later, just in time to catch him to go back and try to find us. I want to limit it to important issues, but we, to have food, we would go find beech nuts and turn them in. 100 pounds of beech nut would give you half a gallon of oil or something like that. We would collect mushrooms, take them to stores to sell them. But there was another destructive object that brought us food when they were successful. The Germans, of course, had no weapons, and the wild boars were doing a lot of damage to the neighbors, to the farmers' fields. So the German government asked an American platoon to come out periodically and shoot these wild boars, and if they would shoot one weighing about 200, 250 pounds, they would divide it among us. And that's the only meat we ever got to see, other than the pound of horse meat for which we had to stand in line for 36 hours. And it was a rainy morning when my uncle and his kids were equally in this village. And I had a cousin by the name of Eberhard Burchert, my identical first and last male name. He was my uncle's first son, and I guess my father must have copied the name because we both had the same name, both first and last name. And we were supposed to line up about a 2-mile wide strip of woods, about 4 miles long, make noise to chase these boars out of the woods, and the shooters were given instructions never to shoot into the drive, but only after the boars break out. And once previously, a boar had been wounded and attacked us. We had to seek refuge on a tree. Well, this particular morning, we were just joking around, going through the woods. My cousin was about 5-6 feet away from me. And all of a sudden, about 15 rounds of bullets hit the tree next to me and next where they were. And I hit the ground. And with that, I hear a gargling sound. And I crawled around the bush to see a blood stream going towards the path, only to discover that my cousin, by same name, had been shot in the shoulder through his carotid artery, and he bled to death on the spot. It was almost like there were 2 of us and one was too many. I don't know. I was left behind. But those were the experiences of wartime and survival, and now we get into more peaceful matters. At the age of about 13, I began playing soccer in this village. In fact, they better play with me because I had the only ball in town. It's funny when I nowadays see teams here practice on soccer fields, and otherwise they have baskets and nets full of soccer balls. We had one ball. I even loaned it to the adult team so they could play. It was, scarce. Well, I improved, and we moved to another city where I played for the youth team. And eventually, a team out of Frankfurt in the first division, when I was 20, drafted me, and I played in the Bundesliga, which is the first division. It's like major leagues here. And I played 12 times for the German national team. Many of the matches, preliminary matches for the event that won the World Cup for Germany in 1954. This was in Bern, Switzerland. Germany beat Hungary very unexpectedly, 3-2. By now, I had moved to Frankfurt, where, in addition to my soccer career, in those days you couldn't make a living just playing soccer like I do nowadays with million-dollar contracts. So I worked in a department store that had many Americans visiting as an interpreter part-time. And one day I waited on an American couple who, in the course of conversation, asked, "Why don't you come to America?" Well, I told them I was always in love with America. See, what happened is right after World War II, the American government was trying to cultivate Germany in American ways so as to prevent Russia from doing the same for their political leanings. And we used to see beautiful movies with stars like Rita Hayworth and Burt Lancaster and the like. And these American women were so glamorous compared to the dull German women that had still the effects of World War II. That was one reason why I wanted to come to America. Another one was a German writer by the name of Karl May, who had written over 100 novels, all dealing with cowboys and Indians, and yet he had never set foot in American soil. And I lived, as a young man, I lived the life of Old Shatterhand and Old Surehand and Winnetou, the chief of the Apaches. And I just loved all these stories. I was rather disappointed when I first met my Indians at a fishing trip to Canada. They were not what the books presented. Well, I met this elderly couple. He says he was an industrialist from Cleveland, Ohio. And why don't you come to America? I said, well, you have to have a sponsor. And also I was engaged to be married. I had met my first wife on the streetcar. I lived in a youth home and there was not much to eat, so every morning I packed 2 slices of bread with a herring inside. And she felt sorry for me, so she packed another lunch for me every day. And we met at the streetcar, and one thing led to another. We were eventually engaged and married. And where am I? Oh, and he said, well, bring your new wife. Get married, bring your wife. I will offer you a job as a salesman, and I'll let you know. Give me your address. Sure enough, I get a mail from an attorney offering me to sponsor me. But in those days, it took over a year to get your visa to come to America. And in the meantime, Ruth, my first wife of 25 years, had an emergency appendectomy, and after that she went to a sanatorium to get some rest. And while she was gone, a year and a half after applying for the visa, I'm notified that your visa is now available. I picked it up, I sold what few possessions we had. Up to then, we had lived in a room that was about the size from here to the wall. We had to fold up the bed during the day to get in. We had an outhouse, and it was home, it was nice. Well, I get my visa, I sold what few possessions we had, and when she returned, I told her next week, Wednesday, we're flying to America. I bought 2 one-way tickets on Pan American by way of Gander, Newfoundland, and left for America. My sponsor picked us up in New York in a Cadillac driven by a black driver, drove us to Cleveland to an 18-room mansion, and we were joyful to see it, except things began to happen. The maid was let go, and my wife was told, as a sense of gratitude, you have to be the maid. I was told to be the butler, and he had rented us a basement apartment and said, you owe us $2,000 for this furniture that he had furnished. So we were really pretty desperate, and we had been warned by our parents, you come back on your knees begging us to send you money to come back. You know, they didn't want us to go. But after 6 months of this, we had met. One day, Ruth was trying to talk to the janitor of the building, and she only spoke German. In fact, she had to take a bus to work every day, and I told her, if a man talks to you, always say no, you know. And some people would say, isn't it a beautiful day? No, you know. That was tough. Every morning. Well, anyway, after 6 months of this, in a very pleasant manner, I asked him for this job he had promised us, and he was very nasty, and we quit. And our salvation became a couple who, among 400,000 Jews out of Budapest, had been taken to Auschwitz and lost all their family except themselves in Auschwitz concentration camp. And to me, to this day, these are the most wonderful friends. That here we were the Germans, we killed their people, you know, and yet they were so wonderful. To this day, they live in Encino, California, and Joe, you might be familiar with that. In October, my daughter from California and I visited them to thank them for a lifetime of helping us, being good to us. They're 91 now, and they have a daughter named Eve, and guess where I got my name? Anyway, we quit the job. I ultimately paid off the $2,000, $50 at a time. And Ruth was a journeyman seamstress. You know, in Germany, you have an apprenticeship of 3-4 years, and she had graduated, and she was a good seamstress. So she found a job at Higbee's department store in Cleveland in alterations. Every morning, I had to go and interpret for her what she had to do. And I, in turn, worked in this men's suit department, where I met the manager of Allegheny Ludlum's Steel Corporation's office in Cleveland, who told me about a job opening they had for a sales correspondent. He worked there part-time. I got the job and worked in the sales office of this steel mill, except it was of short duration. After 3 months America, of that job, or 10-month America, I was drafted into the American Army. And the Army, in those days, they had laws which indicated that if you have an immigration visa and you intend on becoming a citizen, they take you up front. So at the age of 23, I was drafted, sent to Fort Carson, Colorado for basic training, where the sergeant, the first few days of basic, asked for all those with any prior military service, raise your right hand. You know, I raised my hand. He didn't bother to ask what military service I had had. The answer obviously would have been Hitler Youth, 2 years. When Ruth received that first postcard from my basic training camp, she got so homesick for me that she took a leave of absence, and without being able to speak English, hitchhiked from Cleveland, Ohio to Colorado Springs. Showed up at the guest house, said, I want to see my husband. And they said, no, you can't, because we're here to train the men, not take care of wives. Well, she put on a show, I guess, and they relented, and I was given a weekend pass. And God blessed us in that my oldest daughter, Maureen, was conceived. And that helped us later getting an assignment by the Army to Germany. I was stationed 40 miles from home. And throughout my military tour of duty for 3 years, I was still a German citizen. I was not an American citizen. I was in the motor pool. I bought a 1949 Buick of a sergeant that was just returning to the US for $350. It was a beautiful car, you know. What's this? A Buick making a left turn, you know. And it burned oil, but then I was in the motor pool, so that didn't matter much. And the Army assignment, while I was in the motor pool, I was an ordnance parts specialist by MOS. They used me primarily for interpreting maneuver damages and so on. We'd go into maneuver once a month, and along the Rhine River, the big tanks would disappear in the swamp, and then they couldn't get them out. Even the tank retriever couldn't find them. So I had to go to a railroad crossing and bribe the railroad attendant with 2 cartons of cigarettes to let us have a truckload of railroad ties. Except, you know what happened. The ties would disappear in the mud, and we never see them again. So we had, oh, I don't need any, no. No, thank you, I'm fine. I beg your pardon? Oh yeah, we're getting there, And I haven't used my script at all. I mean, I'm not following it. I was doing well in the Army. In fact, the company asked me to form a soccer team because they had heard I played professionally. And in those days, 1956, not too many Americans played soccer. You know, some ethnic people, but that's about it. And I had played, on weekends, I played with a semi-pro German team as an American GI, you know. And we challenged the U.S. Army All-Star team, who had never lost a match. Well, on a Friday night, we played them before beer and hamburgers and so on. We beat them 7-0. And they never, until we told them what happened, is of the 11 players on my team, 10 were semi-pro players in Germany. But it was a good time in the Army, and I was proud to be an American soldier. It was my ticket of admission to this great country, a country I love dearly, and the only thing I love more dearly is you guys. You are just absolutely... Make it short. I came back after my tour of duty of 2 years. The third year was a reserve obligation, which was on weekends only. The steel company was interviewing some 300-400 people for 6 sales jobs, and I was one selected. In Pittsburgh, I went through a 6-month training program. All the steel mills. The company produced the biggest producer of stainless steel, electrical steel. That's the little layers that go into transformers and motors and so on, and high temperature alloys. And they're used for turbine blades and jet engines and so on, like those that flew off the Southwest airplane. Well, after our training period, I was assigned to the export department. A wonderful job for 12 years. I traveled to Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Mexico 3-4 times a year. I lived 2 years in Geneva, Switzerland, 1 year in Brussels, Belgium, every summer 3 weeks in Paris, where we attended the Paris Air Show and had the honor at the George Cinq Hotel to become friendly with the Apollo 9 astronauts who had just returned from space and been sent there as ambassadors for the U.S. to the air show. Their names were McDivitt, Schweikert, and Scott. We were, all of us were invited to the home of the American ambassador to France, which at the time was Sergeant and Eunice Shriver of the Kennedy clan. I met Maria Schreiber when she was 9 years old. It was a wonderful job. Then became vice president of a steel subsidiary of this company in Chicago. And after a great career, country club membership for 40 years, we decided in 2000 to move to Vancouver, Washington, because Carol's children lived in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. And that's where I met her. And today we have a wonderful relationship with her kids. I mean, especially one of them has been familiarized with my outage as a transgender person, very accepting. So is my oldest daughter. My youngest daughter here in Venice is not. It was okay if I did this occasionally, but when I came out full-time last year, April, urged on by my friends at Gran Paradiso, where I live, they said, "Oh, people are nice here, you go ahead, you be Eve, So my dream was fulfilled, except I lost a daughter. She said she loves her dad, and I'm her hero, and I'm the one that taught her all things in life, and she would not accept it. She had never seen me, has never to this day seen me this way. We came ultimately, after 4 or 5 months of non-aggression pact, to an agreement whereby when I see her, either at my place or her place or the shop, it's Eberhard. I take the makeup off. At my age of 85, I think it's better to not lose a daughter. I'm the same person anyway, so it doesn't matter whether I wear drag for a day. So that's the happy part, and then of course I cannot say enough about the wonderful congregation I've met here. You people are unreal. I've been a member of many denominations. I grew up Catholic, and then when we came to Cleveland, I attended a Baptist church, and then in Chicago, a Presbyterian church, which was very snobbish, And none of them were pleasing to me. And I walked in these doors, and it's just one love affair after another. I love you much, and I can't wait to be here on weekends. And I was urged to write a book. I'm not a writer, I'm not an author, but I tried the best I could to recollect my memories, and so I hope for the best. I belong to a writers group here in Chicago. They have, on occasion, criticized some chapters of mine, and that's helpful. Thank you for using part of your day. Got some pictures. Anyone who wants a picture?
Okay. Thank you, Eve.
You're welcome.
You have a fascinating story. Thank you. There we go. Thank you for sharing. Oh, I guess I'm not on, so
Well, it was helter-skelter,
I know that there are lots of questions, right? So let's just take maybe 10 minutes, and
Sure.
if anyone wants to ask a question, let Eve answer it. So are you okay with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Anybody with a question?
Please. Oh, I just wanted to give you an idea what we looked like at one point. That was me. That's my wife, Carol, for 36 years. She's the model. And those are caricatures done at Provincetown, Cape Cod. And that's Caitlyn Jenner in the middle there between my daughter and me. And these are just pictures of my wife, and this is one of us that I like personally. Any questions you have, any close look at the map you want to do, please do.
So you were married twice?
Yes, 25 years first time. And yes, this is an important part I missed. We were living in Geneva, Switzerland when I found a magazine that talked about Christine Jorgensen, the first American GI who had surgery in Denmark in 1952. And up to that point, I had, in 7 years of that marriage at the time, kept my desires totally secret to my wife. But now I had seen that, and I got all excited, and I insisted she see me this way. And I had a terrible wardrobe, but anyway, from that point on, she wanted a divorce. And for the next 18 years, it's amazing we survived that long, but it was 2 kids, economy, money, that we stayed together for 18 more years. And then as I announced that I would be going to this charm school in Portland, Oregon, she said, well, when you come back, I have filed for divorce and all your stuff is outside the window. And it was a relief because nobody had the guts to. In fact, my daughter now says she knew all along that we should not continue in our marriage. Ruth was a nice person, but she just couldn't deal with this. You know. Is it? Thank you. Oh, Koch. Koch. That's the Gauleiter of East Prussia.
Gene, I think you had...
Yeah, that's he who was the Gauleiter of East Prussia. Gauleiter is a governor, you know.
Gene had, Reverend Gene?
What do you do in part 2?
Part 2? Live a couple more years.
Maybe that wasn't following. Was your brother, did he survive?
All right, so the question was about Eve's brother.
It's a good question. My brother was gay. He tried 2 marriages, and I have to tell you an episode that is just startling. And the second marriage gave birth to a girl. And after they were divorced, I learned from my mother only, by correspondence from Germany, that she heard that his former wife and the young girl had married a GI and moved to America. So on a given day, my wife and I are making a sales call on a company in Dayton, Ohio. And we're in the lobby of this company waiting to be seen, and a young woman walks across the lobby, and I turned white. I asked the receptionist, is this young woman by chance German? Yes, she is. It was my niece. I had never seen her, never met her, but I somehow instinctively knew. And to this day, we have a nice relationship by correspondence. You know, she lives in Dayton. It's amazing. My brother, to answer your question, died at age 57 of AIDS. He and I were totally different. We had, even as a young man, I had always many friends, or girlfriends too. He never had any, you know, he was always very much by himself. And so we had very little relationship. He was very bright. He once dumped a whole bucket of coal on the teacher's legs, you know.
Okay. Anyone? Glenn?
No, not my parents. The 91-year-olds is that Jewish couple that had been of such great help to us, and to this day are my best friends. They live in Encino, Kurt and Rosalie Brunner. They're not well, you know. He has had a stroke, and my wife
Terry?
When did you lose your mother?
Oh, she died, you know, she died pretty early. I would say 30 years ago. She was 65 or thereabouts. She didn't live a good life, you know. In those days, number one, she had a lot of trauma, but also the food and smoking did her in the end, and she died in Germany of a heart attack. In fact, she was at a heart sanatorium. Germans are famous for their sanatoriums, you know. And she was at a heart sanatorium, and the last day my brother-in-law at the time was picking her up to take her home, and as she was packing her suitcase, she died. My mother was the main aspect in my life. My father had very little to do with my upbringing. He was a soldier, and he was always away from us, even when I grew up from age baby to end of war, you know, I hardly ever saw him. But he was a good man. Yeah, it's amazing, you know, because, I tell you, we were so close to it. I've left out so many times when Russian fighter planes, we were on the street and we hit the ditch because in the snow, you know, because they were shooting machine gun fire at you. And many people died. And they just left him there.
Okay. How about 2 more questions? Terry?
I want to say one thing. I have children, and my children thought they had such a horrible childhood. This was a horrible childhood. God bless you.
Thank you. Well, I have to tell you an interesting story. In Niedershausen, I was now 12, and we lived in a small room, straw mats. And the neighboring woman had a little farm, 200-acre farm, and 2 cows. And her husband had died in the war in Russia. In order to have food, I get up at the age of 12, 13, get up at 4 a.m. every morning, go milk the 2 cows, go to school in Weilburg, 6 miles away. After school, put the 2 cows on the wagon, go out the field and do all the plowing, raking, mowing, whatever it took. You know, in exchange, I got to eat. You know, talking about...
Okay, we have one more question. I think. Okay, how about we'll go Pat and Ricky.
Was that, what? Oh, sure. My parents did, yeah.
All right, Pat?
Hearing the story for the first time.
You all hear?
Yeah, I heard, yeah. Being comfortable, yeah.
But my question is, you're so comfortable now, and throughout your life you were in other apparel, shall we say. Did you know that this is what you wanted to be?
All my life I wanted to be a woman. You know, I admire women from day one.
But are you just pretending to be a man?
No, I didn't
Dressed
pretend.
as a male.
Let's say it this way, there were circumstances like the war. You didn't have time to think about that. You just tried to survive. And then soccer. I excelled in soccer. I wanted to prove that I was really a man, you know. And I excelled in that. And then the army. I was Soldier of the Year in Germany. You know, it was a parade given in my honor. And I did things thoroughly. I'm very German in that way. I'm very disciplined. You know, I obey. If I have any heartache nowadays, I'm lonesome at times. You know, I have a very nice place, but
Call me.
yeah, thank you very much. But I miss my partner terribly. And contrary to most transgendered people who will abandon their families and their wives and so on, I withheld that. You know, for 61 years I was married and loyal. No neighbor of mine ever knew about my existence. To this day, when they get that book, they will for the first time know that I was transgender. Because I promised Carol on the way from Oregon to Chicago when she came to be with me full time. She said, "What's next, you know? What are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "Carol, I really don't know. But one thing is for sure, I will never ever embarrass you or affect your integrity." And I never did. Both wives. No one ever knew Eve existed. And yet I've given 400 presentations to college students. I've given presentations to 120 FBI agents at Quantico, Virginia. I've done numerous presentations to doctors and law enforcement people. I've done 20 television appearances in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Any place but Chicago. Oprah invited me to come on her show. But I lived in Chicago and I belonged to a country club. a funny story about the country club. When Carol came and she followed Ruth at the country club, and it's very cliquish. In order to integrate her into the mainstream of the club, we participated in what they called the Follies production. This is a Follies production at the fall of every year by members, 4 members. And it would be about 400 people in the audience. We went to this one casting call, and that was nothing for me, so I went home. Later she came to the house and said, guess what, we're going to do cabaret. And I'll be, what do you call it, girl, dancing girl, I said, well, that's nice. She said, yeah, and we didn't have enough girls, so they took Rudy, one of the members of the club. They asked him, would he be in it? I said, why didn't you volunteer me? Well, the next day at the gas station, I meet the choreographer, and she says, what are you doing in the Follies? I said, nothing. She said, how would you like to be a girl in the Follies? I tell you, I have to show you pictures sometime. Blonde wig, garters, and the high heels. There were guys in the audience who said, who's the tall blonde? I've never seen her, and I play golf with them every That's some good times.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming and staying. And Eve, I just want to say, Eve, we love you, and you enrich our experience here at SunCoast, and we are so blessed to have you as a member. So thank you.